Hell's Angel sees a poor blind girl abandoned. At the bus stop, the truth left him stunned. The evening wind whipped through the empty streets as Luke Malone's weathered pickup truck rumbled down Main Street. His large, tattooed hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind already on the work waiting for him at his garage. The setting sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the autumn chill had most folks hurrying home. That's when he saw her. A young woman stood alone at the bus stop, her blonde hair tousled by the increasingly bitter wind. She clutched a white cane in her trembling hands, and what caught Luke's attention most was the dark scarf wrapped around her eyes. Her shoulders hunched against the cold, and she seemed lost, turning her head this way and that as if searching for something she couldn't see. Luke's foot instinctively hit the brake, his truck's tires squealing in protest. He watched as a bus drove past without stopping, leaving the girl even more confused and distressed. She took a hesitant step forward, then back, clearly unsure of what had happened. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Something in Luke's chest tightened. Despite his intimidating appearance, the tattoos that covered his arms, the leather jacket that had seen better days, he'd never been able to ignore someone in need. It was what had driven him to change his life, to leave his troubled past behind. "Hey there," he called out softly as he approached, making sure his heavy boots scuffed the ground to announce his presence. "Miss? Are you all right?" The girl startled, clutching her cane closer. I think I missed my bus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke noticed her clothes were clean, but wrinkled, as if she'd been wearing them for too long. Her face, what he could see of it below the scarf, was pale and drawn. "Another bus won't be coming through for hours," he said gently. "It's getting mighty cold out here. There's a shelter just a few blocks away. I could give you a ride if you'd like." She hesitated, and Luke understood why. He probably sounded like every stranger she'd been warned about. "I know I might not sound like the safest option," he admitted, "but I promise you, I just want to help. Name's Luke Malone. I run the garage over on 5th Street. A particularly harsh gust of wind made the girl shiver violently. I'm Grace," she managed through chattering teeth. "Listen, Grace," Luke said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "You're going to freeze out here. My truck's warm, and I'll take you straight to the shelter. You can hold onto your cane, keep your phone out, whatever makes you feel safe." Grace took a small step toward his voice. "You really know where the shelter is?" "Been volunteering there every other weekend for the past 5 years," Luke replied. He watched as she processed this information, her fingers flexing around her cane. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Moving slowly, telegraphing his movements even though she couldn't see them, Luke stepped closer. "I'm going to help you to the truck now, all right? It's just a few steps away." When Grace nodded again, Luke gently placed one large hand on her elbow, while his other arm supported her back. She was so small compared to him, so fragile. With infinite care, he guided her to the passenger side of his truck and helped her in, making sure she was settled before closing the door. As he walked around to the driver's side, Luke couldn't help but wonder what circumstances had brought this young woman to his small town, alone and vulnerable. Starting the engine, he glanced at his passenger, who sat rigidly in her seat, still clutching her cane like a lifeline. Something told him there was more to Grace's story than met the eye. The heater hummed softly in Luke's truck as they drove through the quiet streets. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, her white cane resting against her leg. The dark scarf around her eyes made it impossible to read her expression, but Luke could sense her unease in the way she held herself, straight-backed and tense. "Thank you," she said quietly, breaking the silence, "for helping me back there." Luke kept his eyes on the road, careful to drive smoothly. "No need to thank me. Couldn't leave you out there in the cold." His gruff voice was gentler than usual. "I'm Luke Malone, by the way. Don't think I properly introduced myself before." Grace's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "I'm Grace Turner." She paused, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. I'm new in town. Just arrived yesterday." Luke nodded, then remembered she couldn't see the gesture. "That's quite a way to start your visit," he said. "Family around here?" The question seemed to hit a nerve. Grace's shoulders tensed even more, and she turned her face toward the passenger window. "No," she whispered. "No family anymore. My parents—" Her voice caught. "There was an accident. 3 months ago." The pain in her voice made Luke's chest tighten. He'd heard that kind of grief before, raw and fresh like an open wound. "I'm sorry," he said simply, knowing no words could really help. "The bus was supposed to take me to the shelter," Grace continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know where else to go. Everything happened so fast after the funeral, and then—" She trailed off, her hands clasping together tightly. Luke slowed the truck as they approached a red light. In the glow of the street lamps, he could see tears tracking down Grace's cheeks from beneath her scarf. Without thinking, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a clean shop rag. Not ideal, but better than nothing. "Here," he said, gently touching her hand with the cloth. "It's clean, I promise." Grace accepted it with a whispered thanks, dabbing at her cheeks. "I must seem so pathetic," she said, trying to force a laugh that came out more like a sob. "Crying in a stranger's truck." "Nothing pathetic about grief," Luke replied firmly, "or asking for help when you need it." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the only sound the quiet rumble of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Grace. When Luke finally pulled into the shelter's parking lot, he turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. Grace's hand found the door handle, but she didn't open it. "Would you—" She hesitated, then turned toward him. "Would you mind staying, just for a minute? I know you probably have places to be, but—" Luke looked at the shelter's entrance, then back at Grace. He should get back to the garage. He had work waiting, responsibilities, but something about leaving her here alone didn't sit right with him. Still, he wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainty. Finally, Grace's fingers tightened on the door handle. Without another word, she pushed it open and stepped out into the evening air, leaving Luke with his thoughts. Luke's truck rumbled through the darkening streets as he headed home. The image of Grace, standing alone at that bus stop, kept playing in his mind like a broken record. Something about her story didn't add up. Her clothes, though wrinkled, were expensive, designer labels he'd noticed when helping her into his truck. And her manner of speaking was refined, each word carefully chosen and pronounced with the kind of polish that came from private schools, not public ones. In his small apartment above the garage, Luke heated up leftover pizza and settled into his worn leather recliner. The evening news droned on in the background, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Grace. He'd seen plenty of people down on their luck over the years, but she was different. The way she carried herself, even in distress, spoke of a life far removed from the streets. He pulled out his phone and typed "Grace Turner accident" into the search bar. Nothing relevant came up. No news articles about wealthy parents dying, no mention of a tragic accident. It was as if she'd appeared out of nowhere. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Luke tossed and turned, his mind wrestling with doubts. Had he been too trusting? In his younger days, he'd seen enough cons and scams to know how convincing some people could be. But Grace's tears had seemed genuine, her pain real. The next morning, Luke was elbow-deep in an engine when he heard footsteps approaching the garage. He looked up to see Grace standing in the doorway, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. She'd changed clothes, a simple but clearly expensive sweater and tailored pants. Her dark scarf was still wrapped around her eyes. "How did you find me?" Luke asked, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I asked around at the shelter," Grace replied. "Everyone knows Luke's garage." She took a hesitant step forward. "I need to tell you something. I wasn't completely honest yesterday." Luke stayed quiet, watching as she pulled an envelope from her purse. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out. "This is from my lawyer," she said. "I'm not poor, Luke. Far from it." She took a deep breath. "My name is Grace Turner, of the Boston Turners. My family owns half the shipping ports on the East Coast, or at least they did until my parents died." Luke's eyebrows shot up. The Boston Turners were practically royalty in New England. He'd seen their name in the business sections of newspapers. "The thing is," Grace continued, her voice growing strained, "everything's frozen right now. The estate, the accounts, all of it. My uncle—" She swallowed hard. "He's challenging the will. Says I'm not competent to manage the inheritance because of my blindness. He's cut me off completely. No access to funds, no family support, nothing." She held up the letter again. "My lawyer says it could take months, maybe years, to sort it all out. I ran because—" Her voice cracked. "Because I couldn't stand being trapped in that house anymore, being treated like I was broken or stupid just because I can't see." Luke stared at the letter in her hand, his mind racing to process this revelation. The girl he'd rescued from a bus stop wasn't just some lost soul. She was an heiress, cut off from her fortune and fighting for her rightful inheritance. "I understand if you don't want to get involved," Grace said softly. "It's complicated, and I know how it must look." The neon sign of Joe's Diner cast a soft pink glow across their booth by the window. Luke watched as Grace wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of coffee, her dark scarf still covering her eyes. The evening crowd was thin, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly couple 2 booths down. "My parents built everything from scratch," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shipping company started with one small boat. My father worked 18-hour days. My mother handled all the paperwork from our kitchen table." A slight smile crossed her face at the memory. Luke stirred his black coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. "And your uncle?" "Uncle Richard." Grace's smile faded. "He joined the business later, when it was already successful. He always resented that my father was in charge." She took a small sip of coffee. "After the accident that took my parents, everything changed. My blindness." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "It wasn't always permanent. There was a time when the doctors thought I might recover." The waitress appeared with their orders, a burger for Luke, soup for Grace. Luke watched as Grace carefully felt for her spoon, her movements precise and practiced. "Uncle Richard used my condition against me," she continued. "He convinced the board I wasn't capable of handling the company, started spreading rumors about my mental state." Her voice cracked slightly. "The servants at the mansion, people I'd known my whole life, stopped talking to me, started treating me like I was made of glass." Luke leaned forward, his food forgotten. "But the inheritance is legally yours?" "Yes. My parents' will was clear. Everything goes to me when I turn 25. Grace stirred her soup slowly. "That's what scares my uncle the most. He has 2 more years to either force me out or—" She left the sentence unfinished. The bell above the diner's door chimed. Luke glanced up to see a man in a gray suit enter. Something about his careful scanning of the room set off warning bells in Luke's mind. The man was too polished for this small-town diner, his shoes too expensive, his watch too flashy. The stranger approached their booth, pulling out a leather wallet. "Excuse me," he said smoothly, revealing a private investigator's badge. "I'm Thomas Wheeler. I'm looking for information about a young woman who might have passed through here recently." Luke felt Grace stiffen across from him. He kept his face neutral, years of experience helping him maintain a calm exterior. "Lots of people pass through here," he said evenly. "It's a diner." Wheeler pulled out a photograph. "This is Grace Turner. Her family is very concerned about her whereabouts." His eyes lingered on Grace for a moment too long, though she kept her face turned toward her soup. "Haven't seen her," Luke replied, his voice gruff but steady. "Maybe try the bus station?" Wheeler's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course." He placed a business card on the table. "If you do see her, please give me a call. Her family is quite worried about her mental state." The investigator left as smoothly as he'd arrived, the bell chiming his exit. Luke watched through the window as he got into a black sedan parked across the street. Grace's hands were trembling. "He's one of my uncle's men," she whispered. "He's been following me." Luke reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. The business card lay between them like a threat, its elegant typography spelling out danger. Luke sat at his worn kitchen table, turning an old photograph in his rough hands. The kitchen light flickered occasionally, casting shadows across the image of a younger version of himself standing next to his father. They were both smiling, but Luke knew the tension hidden behind those grins. His fingers traced the edge of the photo, worn smooth from years of handling. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as memories washed over him. His father's disappointment when Luke joined the motorcycle gang. His mother's tears the day he left home. The look on his sister's face when he missed her wedding because he was locked up for a bar fight. Each memory stung like salt in an old wound. He got up and walked to the sink, filling a glass with water. The pipes groaned. Another thing he needed to fix. The house was full of broken things, just like his past. Luke leaned against the counter, remembering the day his father had finally given up on him. "You're no son of mine," he'd said. Those words still echoed in his head 20 years later. His gaze drifted to the small box on top of his refrigerator. Inside were letters from his mother, unopened but kept safe. She'd written regularly for years, even after he'd stopped responding. The last one had arrived 3 years ago, just before she passed away. He'd never found the courage to read them. Grace's situation stirred something in him. He understood what it felt like to be cut off from family, to feel the ache of rejection. But his wounds were self-inflicted. He'd chosen his path, burned his own bridges. Grace was different. She was the victim of someone else's greed and manipulation. Luke ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath his fingers. The tattoos on his arms, remnants of his wilder days, seemed to mock him. Each one told a story of mistakes and regrets. He'd worked hard to change, to become someone different, but the past never really let go. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window he could see Grace standing on his porch, her white cane tapping gently against the steps. The porch light cast a gentle glow around her, making her look almost ethereal. Luke opened the door, the hinges creaking slightly. "Grace, is everything okay?" "I'm sorry to come so late," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But after what happened at the diner, I don't know who else to turn to." She clutched a folder to her chest. "I need help figuring out what's really going on with my family. That investigator showing up, it's not a coincidence." Luke stood silent for a moment, knowing this was a crossroads. Getting involved meant possibly stirring up trouble, maybe even falling back into old patterns of violence he'd worked so hard to leave behind. But looking at Grace, vulnerable yet determined, he saw someone who needed the kind of help he wished he'd had years ago. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside. "We can talk about it." His voice was gruff but gentle. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll listen." Grace stepped inside, relief visible on her face. "Thank you, Luke. That's all I can ask for right now." The law office of Harrison and Associates occupied a modest brick building on Main Street. Luke's weathered truck looked out of place among the sleek sedans in the parking lot. He held the door open as Grace navigated the entrance with her cane, her steps careful but determined. Inside, the office smelled of leather and coffee. Mrs. Harrison, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and kind eyes, greeted them from behind a polished mahogany desk. "Grace, dear, please, both of you, have a seat." Luke lowered himself into one of the plush chairs, feeling oversized and awkward in the refined space. His work boots had left traces of garage grime on the carpet, and he shifted uncomfortably. "I've reviewed your case thoroughly, Mrs. Harrison began, shuffling through a stack of papers. "There's good news and challenging news. Your parents set up a trust fund that provides monthly allowances. That money is separate from the main estate and should be accessible within the week." Grace's fingers tightened around her cane. "How much?" "Enough to live comfortably and find suitable housing," Mrs. Harrison replied. "But the bulk of your inheritance remains tied up in legal complications. Your uncle's claims to the estate have created quite a tangle." Luke watched Grace's face fall slightly. He cleared his throat. "What kind of complications are we talking about?" Mrs. Harrison adjusted her reading glasses. "There are questions about Grace's ability to manage the estate, given her condition." Her voice softened. "I'm sorry, Grace, but your uncle is using your blindness against you." "That's ridiculous," Luke growled, his hands clenching into fists. Grace reached out, her hand finding Luke's arm with surprising accuracy. "It's okay, Luke. We knew this wouldn't be easy." She turned toward Mrs. Harrison. "What do we need to do next?" "We'll need to gather medical documentation, character witnesses, proof of your independence. It will take time, but we can build a strong case." Luke leaned forward. "I can help. I've got a garage in town, been running it for years. I can offer Grace a job, show she's capable of working." Mrs. Harrison smiled. That would be excellent evidence of independence. They spent the next hour discussing paperwork and legal strategies. Luke watched Grace absorb every detail, asking sharp questions that revealed her intelligence and determination. She wasn't some helpless rich girl. She was a fighter. As they walked out of the office, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, Luke said, "I meant what I said about the job, if you're interested." Grace smiled. "I'd like that, though I don't know much about cars." "We'll figure it out," Luke replied, guiding her toward his truck. A shadow fell across their path. The private investigator from the diner stood before them, his expression grim. Luke instinctively stepped closer to Grace. "Miss Turner," the investigator said quietly, "I need to speak with you." Luke started to object, but Grace touched his arm. "It's all right, Luke. What is it?" The investigator glanced around the parking lot. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but you need to be careful. There are people in your family looking for you, and they're not all as concerned with your well-being as they claim to be." Before either of them could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Back at Luke's garage, Grace sat in the small office while Luke made them both coffee. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal hung in the air. "My Uncle Richard," Grace began, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug, He wasn't always like this. After my parents died, something changed in him. Or maybe I just started seeing who he really was. Luke settled into the creaky chair behind his desk, watching her carefully. What do you mean? He started small at first, Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He'd tell me I couldn't possibly manage the estate in my condition, that I needed his guidance, that the world was too dangerous for someone like me. Her hands trembled slightly. Then he began controlling everything, my doctors, my caregivers, even what I ate and when I slept. Luke's jaw tightened. That's not protection. That's prison. Exactly. Grace set her mug down with careful precision. When I started asking questions about my inheritance, about the estate's finances, She paused, swallowing hard. He told everyone I was having mental episodes, that my blindness had made me paranoid and unstable. Jesus, Luke muttered, his massive hands gripping his coffee mug so tight he thought it might crack. The worst part? Grace's voice cracked slightly. He convinced the family doctor to prescribe me medication I didn't need. Said it was for my own good. When I refused to take it, he threatened to have me committed. Luke stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the small office, trying to contain his anger. That's why you ran. Grace nodded. I had a friend, my old piano teacher. She helped me escape, got me on a bus with some cash and told me to get as far away as possible. She reached for her coffee again, finding it without difficulty. Uncle Richard has always been obsessed with the family fortune. Now I think he's been stealing from it for years, using my condition as a cover. Luke stopped pacing. He'd seen his share of cruel people in his biker days. But this was different. This was calculated evil, wrapped in the pretense of care and family duty. It made his stomach turn. I won't let him hurt you anymore, Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. We're going to fight this. Grace turned her face toward him, her expression a mix of hope and fear. Luke, you don't know what he's capable of. He has connections, money, influence. And we have the truth, Luke interrupted. He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. Plus, I might not have money or influence, but I've got friends who know how to dig up dirt, people who owe me favors. A small smile touched Grace's lips. Are these friends from your Hell's Angels days? Maybe, Luke admitted. But they're good people now. Like me. Grace reached out, her hand finding his arm. I trust you, Luke. I don't know why, but I do. Luke covered her hand with his own. Then let's take him down. Together. We'll need to be smart about it, gather evidence, build a case that even his money can't bury. Where do we start? First, we document everything you just told me. Then we start looking into your family's financial records. Every transaction, every property deal, every penny that's moved since your parents died. Luke squeezed her hand gently. We're going to expose him, Grace, all of it. Grace straightened in her chair, a new determination in her posture. Yes, it's time to stop running. The morning sun streamed through the garage windows as Luke poured their third cup of coffee. Grace sat quietly, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her ceramic mug. The familiar sounds of the garage, the distant hum of machinery, the occasional clang of tools, filled the thoughtful silence between them. We need to face him directly, Luke said finally, his voice firm but gentle. No more hiding. No more running. Grace's hands tightened around her mug. You want to walk right into his house after everything I told you? Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Luke settled into the chair across from her. Your uncle's used to people cowering from him. He won't expect you to show up at his doorstep. That's what scares me, Grace whispered. She set her coffee down, her movements careful and precise. He's always been in control, always 10 steps ahead. Luke leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But he's never dealt with someone like me before. I may not have his money or his fancy lawyers, but I know how bullies work. They're strongest when their victims are isolated and afraid." Grace tilted her head, considering his words. "And you think showing up unannounced will throw him off balance?" "Exactly." Luke's voice carried a quiet confidence. "He's probably got all sorts of legal maneuvers planned, expecting you to fight this in court. But a face-to-face confrontation? That's different." "He'll try to manipulate the situation," Grace warned. "He's very good at twisting things, making people doubt themselves." Luke reached across the table, gently touching her hand. "That's why I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." Grace turned her palm up, squeezing his hand. "You really think this could work?" "I think it's our best shot at getting the truth." Luke's thumb traced small circles on her hand. "And sometimes, Grace, the truth is all you need to bring down even the biggest lies." They spent the next hour planning their approach. Luke insisted on driving his truck rather than calling a cab. He wanted to ensure they had a quick way out if needed. Grace provided directions to the estate, her voice growing tighter as they got closer to their destination. As they turned onto a private road lined with ancient oaks, Grace's breathing quickened. "We're almost there," she said softly. "The gates should be coming up on the right." Luke slowed the truck as they approached a massive wrought iron gate. Beyond it stretched a long, winding driveway bordered by perfectly manicured hedges. At the end, barely visible through the morning mist, stood a mansion that looked more like a small castle than a home. He pulled the truck to a stop just before the gate. "Well, that's something." Grace gave a small, humorless laugh. "Impressive, isn't it? That's what Uncle Richard lives for. Impressing people, showing off his power." Luke stared at the imposing structure, taking in the security cameras mounted on the gate posts, the high stone walls that surrounded the property. Everything about it screamed money and control. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Grace's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but her chin was held high. "No," she admitted, "but I don't think I'll ever be more ready than I am right now." They sat there in silence, the engine idling softly, both acutely aware of the magnitude of what they were about to do. The morning mist swirled around the truck, making the mansion seem even more imposing, more untouchable. The crunch of gravel under their feet echoed in the morning air as Luke and Grace made their way up the sweeping front steps. Luke kept his hand gentle but steady on Grace's elbow, guiding her. The mansion loomed over them, its stone facade cold and unwelcoming despite the morning sun. Luke pressed the ornate doorbell, and deep chimes resonated from within. Grace's fingers tightened on her white cane, her knuckles turning pale with tension. Footsteps approached from inside, measured and unhurried. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s. Vincent Turner's silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit without a wrinkle. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he regarded them. "Grace," Vincent said, his voice smooth as honey, but just as sticky. "What an unexpected surprise." His gaze flicked dismissively over Luke before returning to his niece. "And who might this gentleman be?" "Uncle Vincent." Grace's voice was steady despite her rigid posture. "This is Luke Malone. He's been helping me." "Helping you?" Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly. "I wasn't aware you needed help, my dear. After all, you're the one who chose to leave." "May we come in?" Grace asked, ignoring his barb. "We need to talk." Vincent stepped back, gesturing with exaggerated courtesy. "By all means, though I must say showing up unannounced is rather unconventional." They followed him into a vast foyer, their footsteps echoing off marble floors. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting rainbow patterns on the walls. Luke felt out of place in his work boots and leather jacket, but he kept his head high. Vincent led them to a formal sitting room, where sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Please, sit," he said, though his tone made it sound more like a command than an invitation. Grace settled onto a silk-upholstered chair, her movements careful but confident. Luke remained standing behind her, his presence solid and protective. "Now then," Vincent began, lowering himself into an antique armchair. "Would you care to explain why you've been causing such trouble? Running away, hiding from your family? It's all rather dramatic, don't you think?" "Trouble?" Grace's voice took on an edge. "Is that what you call it when someone tries to claim what's rightfully theirs?" Vincent's pleasant expression hardened slightly. "My dear, you're clearly not in your right mind. The accident, your condition—" He gestured vaguely toward her eyes. "You're in no state to manage such responsibilities." "That's not your decision to make," Grace countered. "I want answers, Uncle Vincent, about my parents' estate, about the accident, about everything you've been hiding." Vincent's gaze shifted to Luke, his lip curling slightly. "And I suppose this mechanic has been filling your head with ideas? Really, Grace, consorting with such people is beneath you." "Mr. Malone has shown me more kindness than my own family," Grace said firmly. "He's here because I trust him." "Trust?" Vincent laughed, a cold sound that filled the room. "You trust a stranger over your own blood? A man who likely only sees dollar signs when he looks at you?" Luke's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting Grace fight her own battle. "I want the truth," Grace insisted, her voice rising slightly. "About all of it. No more manipulations, no more lies." Vincent's facade of politeness cracked, revealing something harder underneath. "You're being ridiculous, Grace. I've only ever acted in your best interests. If you continue down this path, you may not like where it leads." The tension in the room crackled like static electricity, making the fine hairs on Luke's neck stand up. Grace sat straight-backed in her chair, facing her uncle's direction with unwavering determination. Vincent's mask of civility had slipped, revealing glimpses of something darker beneath, and Luke stood watch, ready to protect Grace if needed, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the expensive carpet. The moon hung low in the sky, as Luke's truck rolled silently up the mansion's long driveway, headlights off. Grace sat beside him, her fingers drumming nervously on her knee. "Are you sure about this?" Luke whispered, though they were alone in the truck. "We need proof," Grace said firmly. "The gardener told me Uncle Vincent leaves every Tuesday night for his club meeting. We'll have at least 2 hours." Luke killed the engine, and they sat in the darkness. The mansion's windows were dark except for the security lights that cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. Grace pulled out a small key from her pocket. "I still have my old house key," she explained. "Unless he changed the locks." They made their way carefully up the path to a side door. Luke's heart pounded as Grace inserted the key. It turned smoothly, and the door opened without a sound. They slipped inside, closing it behind them. "His study is upstairs," Grace whispered, her hand finding Luke's arm. Though blind, she knew every inch of this house. "Second door on the right." Luke guided her up the grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by thick carpet. The house creaked and settled around them, each sound making them freeze momentarily. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting everything in shades of blue and silver. In the study, Luke helped Grace navigate around the heavy furniture. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Letters, documents, anything that might show what he's hiding." Grace's fingers trailed along the edge of the massive desk. "He always kept important papers in here." Luke started checking drawers while Grace felt her way around the room, her fingers skimming surfaces with practiced ease. Minutes ticked by in tense silence as they searched. "Wait," Grace whispered suddenly. Her hands had found a decorative panel on the wall. "This is new. There used to be a painting here." Luke moved closer, examining the panel in the dim light. "There's a slight gap at the edge," he said, running his fingers along it. With gentle pressure, the panel swung open, revealing a hidden safe. "Can you open it?" Grace asked, hope creeping into her voice. Luke studied the dial. "It's an older model. I might be able to—" He pressed his ear to the safe, turning the dial slowly, listening for the subtle clicks. His years of less-than-legal activities were finally proving useful for something good. After several tense minutes, the safe door swung open with a soft groan. Inside, they found stacks of papers and folders. Luke began sorting through them quickly, describing each document to Grace in hushed tones. "Wait," Grace said suddenly. "That letter you mentioned, the one addressed to my mother. Read it." Luke carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. "My dearest Catherine," he read softly. "If you're reading this, then my suspicions about Vincent were correct. The trust fund I established for Grace cannot be accessed by anyone but her, regardless of her condition. Vincent has no legal right to—" He trailed off, scanning the rest of the letter quickly. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the paper. Luke placed it in her grasp, and she held it tightly, her fingers running over the edges as if trying to absorb its secrets through touch alone. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice shaking. The letter quivered in her hands as she stood there, frozen in indecision. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across their booth. Grace sat with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, while Luke's large frame took up most of the opposite seat. The private investigator, a thin man named Harris, hunched forward between them, speaking in hushed tones. "Vincent Turner isn't just manipulative," Harris said, sliding a folder across the table. "He's dangerous. I've been tracking his activities for months." Luke flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening with each page. "These bank transfers, they're all tied to Grace's inheritance?" Harris nodded grimly. "Every penny. But that's not the worst part." He leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "Vincent has connections with some unsavory characters, people who aren't afraid to use force to protect his interests." Grace's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "What kind of force?" "The kind that makes problems disappear," Harris replied. "Your accident, Grace. I don't think it was an accident at all." Luke's fist slammed against the table, making the silverware rattle. Several heads turned their way, but he didn't care. His face had turned red with anger, and his tattoos seemed darker against his flushed skin. "You're telling me this monster deliberately hurt her?" Luke's voice was a low growl. "His own niece?" "Luke, please." Grace reached across the table, finding his arm. Her touch seemed to calm him slightly, but the tension remained in his shoulders. Harris pulled out another document. "Vincent has been systematically isolating Grace for years. The blindness was just the final step. He's created a web of lies so thick, even some family members believe Grace is mentally unstable." "That's why nobody questioned when I disappeared," Grace whispered, realization dawning on her face. Luke stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced beside their booth, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "We can't let him get away with this." "There might be a way," Harris said, straightening in his seat. "Vincent's power comes from keeping everything hidden. His reputation in the community, the family's respect. It's all built on lies." "What are you suggesting?" Grace asked. "We go public," Harris replied. "Take everything we've found, the financial records, the medical reports, the letter from your father, and expose it all. Once the truth is out, Vincent won't be able to hide anymore. Grace's face paled. But that would mean everyone would know. The whole town, my family. They should know, Luke said, returning to the booth. His voice was gentler now as he spoke to Grace. You've done nothing wrong. Vincent's the one who should be ashamed. The media would have a field day, Harris added. Rich family heir, betrayed by her uncle, left blind and abandoned. It's the kind of story that could force Vincent's hand. Grace sat silently for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. All these years I've been hiding, she said finally. Maybe it's time to stop. I'll be right beside you, Luke promised, reaching across to take her hand. We'll face this together. Grace squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his touch. Okay, she said, turning toward Harris. Let's do it. Let's tell everyone the truth. Harris nodded, gathering his documents. I'll start making calls. Once we go public, there's no turning back. Good, Luke said firmly. It's time Vincent learned he can't bully people forever. Grace straightened in her seat, a new determination visible on her face. He took my sight, she said quietly. But he won't take my life. Not anymore. The newspaper office buzzed with activity as Grace and Luke sat across from Sarah Chen, a veteran investigative reporter known for her hard-hitting exposés. The small conference room felt cramped with Luke's large frame taking up much of the space, but his presence gave Grace comfort as she prepared to share her story. Sarah tapped her pen against her notepad, her expression skeptical. So you're telling me Vincent Turner, one of the most respected businessmen in the state, orchestrated this entire scheme to control your inheritance? Yes, Grace replied, her fingers instinctively touching the dark scarf covering her eyes. I have proof. Financial records, medical reports, and a letter from my father that details everything. Luke placed the folder of documents on the table. The private investigator we worked with verified everything. Vincent's been stealing from Grace for years. Sarah flipped through the papers, her eyebrows rising higher with each page. These bank transfers are substantial. And the timing of your accident? She paused, studying Grace's face. You really believe your uncle was responsible for your blindness? I know it sounds incredible, Grace said softly. But the evidence is there. The doctor said my injury was unusual, targeted even. And right after it happened, Vincent took control of everything. Luke leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Look at the pattern, the isolation, the financial manipulation, the way he's convinced everyone Grace is unstable. It's all documented right there. Sarah continued reading, her professional skepticism slowly giving way to genuine interest. This is disturbing. The medical records alone raise serious questions. She looked up at Grace. You understand what going public means. Once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your entire family will be exposed. I understand, Grace said firmly. I'm tired of hiding. Tired of letting him control my life. Sarah nodded slowly, coming to a decision. All right, I'll help you tell your story. But we need to be thorough. Every detail needs to be verified. Every claim backed up with evidence. They spent the next hour going through the documents, with Sarah asking detailed questions about dates, names, and specific incidents. Luke stayed close to Grace, occasionally squeezing her hand in support when particularly difficult memories came up. As they were wrapping up, Grace's phone rang. The familiar ringtone made her freeze. It's him, she whispered. Luke started to reach for the phone, but Grace shook her head. With trembling fingers, she answered and put it on speaker. You ungrateful little fool, Vincent's voice filled the room, cold and threatening. Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your meeting with the press? Grace's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "You can't control me anymore, Uncle Vincent." "Can't I?" He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Back off now, or you'll regret it. And tell that ex-criminal friend of yours to mind his own business." Luke's fists clenched, but he remained silent, letting Grace handle the call. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Grace asked. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." "You should be," Vincent snarled. "Stay away from my business, or you'll learn exactly what I'm capable of." The line went dead. Grace's hands shook as she set down the phone. Luke immediately moved closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We're doing the right thing," he assured her, his voice gentle but firm. "He's threatening you because he's scared. He knows we have him cornered." Sarah had been quietly taking notes during the call. "That threat just made our story even stronger," she said. "Are you still sure you want to go through with this?" Grace straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from Luke's presence. "More than ever," she replied. "It's time everyone knew the truth." The evening sun cast long shadows through Luke's kitchen window as he stirred a pot of homemade soup. Grace sat at his worn kitchen table, her fingers tracing the wooden grain patterns. The familiar scents of herbs and vegetables filled the air, creating a warmth that went beyond temperature. "You really don't have to cook for me," Grace said, but her soft smile betrayed her appreciation. "After a day like today, we both need some comfort food." Luke's deep voice carried across the kitchen, gentle despite his imposing presence. Grace listened to him move around the kitchen, his heavy boots on the linoleum, the clink of spoons against bowls, the subtle sounds that made her feel oddly at home. It struck her how different this was from her family's formal dining room, with its cold silence and rigid expectations. "Here you go," Luke said, placing a bowl in front of her and guiding her hand to the spoon. His touch lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you," she murmured, "not just for the soup." "For everything, Luke. I don't know what I would have done without you these past few weeks." Luke settled into the chair across from her, his own bowl steaming. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. You would have found a way." "Maybe," she said, tasting the soup. "But I wouldn't have felt safe. Not like this." The word hung between them. Safe. Such a simple word, but it meant everything to Grace. In her world of darkness, touch and trust were everything. And somehow, this rough-edged former biker had become her anchor. Luke cleared his throat, clearly moved by her words but unsure how to respond. "Your uncle's threats today. They got me thinking. There's more to your story than you've told me, isn't there?" Grace's spoon stilled. The warmth of the kitchen suddenly felt heavier, weighted with unspoken truths. She set down her spoon and folded her hands in her lap. "My blindness," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't an accident like I told you before." Luke leaned forward, his chair creaking. "What do you mean?" "The night it happened, I had overheard a conversation. My uncle and someone else, discussing the family business. Something illegal." Grace's hands trembled slightly. "The next day, during my morning ride, I loved horseback riding. Someone spooked my horse deliberately. The fall wasn't supposed to blind me, just scare me into silence. But things went wrong." "Jesus, Grace." Luke's voice was hoarse with shock and anger. "The doctors said it was unusual, the specific damage to my optic nerves, like someone knew exactly what they were doing." Grace's fingers twisted in her lap. "I never saw who did it, but I knew. My uncle's warning today just confirmed what I've suspected all along." Luke's hand found hers across the table, large and warm and steady. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because saying it out loud makes it real," Grace whispered. "And because everyone who's heard this story before either thought I was crazy or was too afraid to help." "I'm not afraid," Luke said firmly, squeezing her hand. "And I believe you. We're going to find proof, Grace. Whatever it takes, we'll uncover the truth." Grace turned her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. In that moment, she felt the shift between them, the deepening of trust into something more, something neither of them had expected but both desperately needed. The morning paper lay spread across Luke's kitchen table, its headline bold and unmistakable. "Iris fights for justice. Questions surround Turner family fortune." Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, while Luke read the article aloud. Grace Turner, daughter of the late business tycoon Robert Turner, claims systematic manipulation of her inheritance following a suspicious accident that left her blind. Luke's deep voice carried through the kitchen. Sources close to the family suggest irregular financial dealings by current estate executor Vincent Turner. "How bad is it?" Grace asked, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her sweater. "It's thorough," Luke replied, turning the page. "The journalist didn't pull any punches. Your uncle's not going to like this one bit." As if on cue, Grace's phone began buzzing on the table. The automated voice announced, "Call from Vincent Turner." "Don't answer it," Luke said quickly, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "Let him sweat." Throughout the day, calls flooded in, not just from her uncle, but from reporters, local news stations, and even old family friends who'd previously ignored her existence. Luke fielded most of them, protecting Grace from the sudden onslaught of attention. By afternoon, social media was ablaze with the story. Luke's neighbor, Sarah, who helped manage their online presence, stopped by with updates. "It's trending locally," Sarah explained, showing Luke her tablet. "People are outraged. The disability rights groups are particularly vocal about how you've been treated, Grace." Grace sat straighter in her chair. "Are they saying anything about the accident?" "Yes, actually. Several medical professionals have come forward questioning the unusual nature of your injury. They're calling for an investigation." Luke watched Grace's face carefully. A mix of relief and anxiety played across her features. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I think so," she nodded. "It's just strange, having people finally listen after all this time." By evening, the pressure had mounted so intensely that Vincent Turner's office released an official statement, claiming all actions taken were legally sound and in the best interest of the estate. But the public wasn't buying it. "Your uncle's law firm just called," Luke announced, hanging up his phone. "They want to meet tomorrow morning. They're saying something about discussing terms." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. "He's scared." "As he should be," Luke growled. "Want me to call Richard?" Richard Thompson, their lawyer, agreed to meet them immediately. His small office felt cramped with both Luke and Grace inside, but his excitement was palpable as he shuffled through papers on his desk. "The article changed everything," Richard explained, pulling out a thick folder. "3 former employees of your uncle's firm have come forward with documentation. Grace, we might have enough to not only reinstate your inheritance but to prove misconduct." "What's the catch?" Luke asked, noting the lawyer's slight hesitation. "It's going to be a long process," Richard admitted. "Months, maybe even a year of legal battles. Your uncle won't go down without a fight, and he has considerable resources." Grace reached for Luke's hand, finding it instantly. "How do we proceed?" "We keep pushing," Richard said firmly. "The public attention gives us leverage we didn't have before. We file the official motion tomorrow, and then we start building our case with these new witnesses." Grace squared her shoulders, her grip on Luke's hand tightening. "Then that's what we'll do. We keep pushing until we get the truth." Luke looked at her with admiration. seeing not the fragile girl he'd first met at the bus stop, but a woman of remarkable strength. Together, he added softly, we keep pushing together. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a man Grace had never met. Luke watched from his garage as the stranger placed it directly into Grace's hands, tipped his hat, and disappeared as quickly as he'd come. "Who was that?" Luke asked, wiping grease from his hands with a worn shop rag. Grace's fingers traced the edges of the envelope. "I'm not sure, but this paper, it's expensive, the kind my mother used to use for her personal correspondence." Her hands trembled slightly. "And I can feel her perfume on it, jasmine and vanilla." Luke guided her to the small office attached to his garage, pulling out the creaky chair behind his desk. "Do you want me to read it to you?" Grace shook her head, her fingers already finding the seal. "No, I need to do this myself." She pulled out a folded piece of paper and ran her fingers over the raised braille dots, a system her mother had learned alongside her after the accident. Luke sat on the corner of his desk, close enough to offer support, but giving her space to process whatever the letter contained. The morning sun streamed through the dusty window, catching the tears that had begun to form in Grace's eyes. "My dearest Grace," she began reading aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're reading this, then everything I feared has come to pass. Your father and I are gone, and Vincent has made his move." Grace paused, taking a shaky breath. Luke placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to accept, but you must know the truth. Your blindness was no accident. Vincent orchestrated it all, the car crash that injured you, the subsequent medical complications. He needed you vulnerable, dependent, and most importantly, discredited." Luke's hand tightened on Grace's shoulder. She continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Your father discovered something terrible about Vincent's business dealings. Offshore accounts, money laundering, connections to people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. When your father threatened to expose everything, Vincent acted first. The brake lines in our car weren't faulty. They were cut." Grace's free hand reached up to clutch Luke's, seeking anchor as the truth of her parents' death washed over her. "But I prepared for this, my dear girl. I've left evidence, documents, recordings, everything your father gathered, in a safe deposit box. The key is with Margaret, my old housekeeper. She's been waiting for the right moment, waiting for you to be strong enough and protected enough to face this fight." Tears fell freely now, dotting the paper as Grace read the final paragraphs. "Your inheritance isn't just money, Grace, it's the truth. The power to bring justice not just for us, but for everyone Vincent has hurt. I'm so sorry we couldn't protect you from this burden, but I know you have the strength to carry it." Luke knelt beside Grace's chair as she reached the end of the letter. "Remember who you are, my brave girl. You are a Turner, yes, but more importantly, you are my daughter. And you have never been alone, even when it felt that way. All my love, always. Mom." The letter fell to Grace's lap as she turned toward Luke, her face a mixture of grief and determination. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew everything, and she left me a way to prove it." Luke gathered her into his arms as the weight of her mother's words settled around them. The small office fell silent except for Grace's quiet tears, each one carrying years of unanswered questions, finally finding their truth. The private investigator's office smelled of stale coffee and old papers. John Miller, a man with weathered features and kind eyes, spread photographs across his desk while Luke and Grace sat opposite him. Sunlight filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting strips of light across the evidence of Vincent Turner's corruption. "Your mother was thorough," Miller said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "These documents show everything. The money trails, the falsified medical records, even surveillance photos from the day of the accident." Grace's fingers traced the edge of the desk. "And you're certain this is enough? With what we have from the safe deposit box, more than enough?" Miller shuffled some papers. "Vincent's been sloppy lately, getting nervous. His accounts don't add up, and several of his business partners are already under investigation." Luke leaned forward, his large frame making the chair creak. "What's our next move, then?" Miller pulled out a manila envelope. "We go public, all of it. The press conference is already arranged for tomorrow morning at the courthouse steps. But first—" He paused, sliding a document across the desk. "Grace needs to sign this affidavit. It's her official statement about everything that's happened." Grace nodded, her face set with determination. "Where do I sign?" Luke guided her hand to the proper spot on the paper, and she signed with practiced precision. The scratch of pen on paper seemed to echo in the quiet office. "Vincent won't take this lying down," Miller warned. "He's already trying to discredit you, Grace, claiming you're mentally unstable, that your blindness has affected your judgment." "Let him try," Grace said firmly. "I'm not afraid anymore." Luke watched her with admiration. The scared girl he'd found at the bus stop was gone, replaced by a woman of remarkable strength. "We'll need to move fast," Miller continued, gathering the documents. "Once we go public, Vincent will try to destroy evidence. I've got people ready to secure his offices and home as soon as the press conference begins." "What about security?" Luke asked, his protective instincts kicking in. "Vincent's got connections. Dangerous ones." Miller nodded. "Already handled. I've got 2 off-duty officers who'll be watching Grace's apartment tonight, and they'll escort us to the courthouse tomorrow." Grace reached for Luke's hand, finding it easily. "Will you stay with me tonight? I don't want to be alone." "Of course," Luke replied without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." They spent the next hour going over their strategy. Miller had arranged for major news outlets to attend the press conference. Grace practiced her statement, her voice growing stronger with each rehearsal. The truth about her parents' death, Vincent's manipulation, the orchestrated accident that took her sight. It would all come to light. As the afternoon sun began to fade, they gathered their materials. Miller handed Luke a thick envelope. "Keep this safe. It's copies of everything, just in case." Outside the office, the autumn air was crisp and cool. Luke helped Grace into his truck, the familiar routine now comfortable between them. They had one night left before everything would change. "Are you ready for this?" Luke asked as he started the engine. Grace turned her face toward him, a small smile playing at her lips. "I've been ready for this my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." They drove through the quiet streets, both lost in thought about the confrontation to come. Tomorrow they would face Vincent and expose his crimes to the world. Tomorrow, Grace would finally reclaim her life and her family's legacy. But for now, they had this moment of calm before the storm, and each other to lean on. The marble halls of the courthouse echoed with footsteps as Grace and Luke made their way toward Courtroom B. Grace's white cane tapped steadily against the polished floor, her steps sure and measured. Luke walked beside her, his large frame providing a barrier between her and the curious onlookers who had gathered for the high-profile case. Their lawyer, Sarah Bennett, walked ahead of them, her heels clicking purposefully. Behind them followed their assembled witnesses, John Miller, the private investigator, Dr. Rachel Chen, Grace's former physician, and 3 of Vincent's former business associates who had agreed to testify about his fraudulent dealings. "Remember," Sarah whispered as they approached the courtroom doors, "let me do all the talking unless you're directly addressed by the judge." Grace nodded, her fingers tightening around her cane. Luke placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she drew strength from his presence. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they opened. The courtroom was already packed with spectators, their whispers creating a low hum that died down as Grace's group entered. Luke guided Grace to their table, pulling out her chair with careful attention. "He's here," Luke murmured, his voice low enough for only Grace to hear. 3 o'clock at the defense table. Grace didn't need to see to know Vincent was smirking. She could feel his presence like a cold draft, could sense his smug confidence radiating across the room. He'd always underestimated her, treated her like a helpless child. That would end today. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "The Honorable Judge Margaret Wilson presiding." The rustle of movement filled the room as everyone stood. Grace rose smoothly, her posture straight and dignified. The judge entered, and soon they were all seated again. "We're here today in the matter of Turner versus Turner," Judge Wilson began, her voice clear and authoritative. "Before we proceed with opening statements, I understand the prosecution has some preliminary evidence they'd like to enter into record?" Sarah stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to submit several key documents, starting with a letter written by Elizabeth Turner, the plaintiff's mother, shortly before her death." Vincent's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, we haven't had time to authenticate this supposed letter." "The letter was recovered from a safe deposit box registered to Elizabeth Turner," Sarah countered. "We have the bank's documentation and verification of Mrs. Turner's signature." Judge Wilson considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, subject to authentication. Proceed, Ms. Bennett." Luke watched as Sarah approached the bench with the letter. It was contained in a clear evidence bag, the paper inside slightly yellowed with age. Grace had memorized every word after they'd found it, but hearing it read aloud in court would make it real, in a way it hadn't been before. "The letter is dated September 15th, 3 days before Elizabeth Turner's death," Sarah began. She unfolded the document carefully and started to read. Grace sat perfectly still as her mother's words filled the courtroom. Luke noticed her hands trembling slightly in her lap, and he gently covered them with his own. She turned her palm upward, gripping his fingers tightly. The letter detailed Elizabeth's suspicions about Vincent's financial manipulations, her fears for Grace's safety, and most damning of all, her discovery of Vincent's involvement in several illegal business dealings. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah read, the only sound the occasional shuffle of paper or muffled cough from the gallery. Luke glanced at Vincent and saw that his smirk had finally faltered. The man's face had grown pale, his jaw clenched tight as he listened to his sister-in-law's words condemn him from beyond the grave. The first blow had been struck. The battle for justice had begun. Sarah Bennett moved with purposeful steps as she approached the judge's bench, carrying a thick manila folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit B, financial records from the Turner Family Trust spanning the last 5 years." The courtroom remained hushed as Sarah distributed copies to the judge, the defense, and kept one for reference. Luke watched Vincent's face carefully, noting how his uncle's confident expression flickered when he saw the documents. "These records," Sarah continued, her voice clear and steady, "show a pattern of suspicious transfers from the family trust to offshore accounts controlled by Vincent Turner. Each transfer coincided with major life events for Grace Turner, including the accident that caused her blindness." Vincent's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These documents weren't included in the original discovery." "These records were obtained through a subpoena of international banks just last week," Sarah countered. "We shared them with the defense as soon as they became available." Judge Wilson studied the papers carefully. "Objection overruled. Continue, Ms. Bennett." Sarah walked to a large screen that had been set up. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to display these transactions in chronological order." As the financial records appeared on screen, Sarah methodically walked the court through each suspicious transfer. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars moved through a complex web of accounts. On March 15th, just 3 days after Grace's accident, Mr. Turner transferred $2.5 million to an account in the Cayman Islands, Sarah pointed out. This same account then funded payments to several medical professionals who later declared Grace mentally unfit to manage her inheritance. Vincent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his previously smug demeanor cracking. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "we call Grace Turner to the stand." Luke squeezed Grace's hand as she rose. She moved with quiet dignity toward the witness stand, her white cane tapping softly against the floor. The bailiff helped her take the oath, and she settled into the chair. "Ms. Turner," Sarah began, "please tell the court about the day of your accident." Grace's voice was clear and steady. "I was at home, walking down the main staircase. Someone had removed the rubber strips from the steps, safety features that had been there my entire life. I slipped and fell." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The doctors said the head trauma caused my blindness." "And who had access to your home at that time?" "My Uncle Vincent had taken over as property manager after my parents' death. He controlled who came and went." Vincent's voice cut through the courtroom. "That's a lie. I would never—" "Mr. Turner," Judge Wilson warned sharply, "you will remain silent or be held in contempt." Grace continued, her composure unwavering. "After my accident, Uncle Vincent had me declared incompetent. He took control of everything, my inheritance, my medical care, even where I could live. When I tried to challenge him, he threatened to have me committed to an institution." As Grace's testimony continued, Luke observed the judge's expression changing from professional neutrality to barely concealed outrage. She leaned forward, taking detailed notes as Grace described years of manipulation and isolation. Vincent's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He scribbled furious notes to his lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ms. Turner," Sarah asked, "why did you finally decide to come forward?" Grace's voice softened. "Because I found people who believed in me, who helped me see that what happened wasn't my fault, and that I deserved better than to be controlled and manipulated by someone who only cared about money." The judge's pen paused over her notepad, her expression grave as she studied both Grace and Vincent. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of Grace's words hanging in the air. Vincent Turner's lawyer suddenly stood up, a thin smile playing across his face. "Your Honor, if I may?" He pulled out a document from his briefcase, approaching the bench with measured steps. "I'd like to present new evidence that drastically changes the nature of this case." The judge accepted the document, her eyes scanning its contents. Luke felt his stomach tighten as he watched Grace's uncle lean back in his chair, his previous nervousness replaced by an unsettling confidence. "This document," Vincent's lawyer announced, "is a legally binding agreement signed by Grace's father just before his death. It specifically states that the Turner family fortune can only be accessed by an heir who is deemed mentally and physically fit to manage it." He paused for effect. "Given Miss Turner's condition, she is automatically disqualified." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Sarah Bennett immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is clearly discriminatory and wouldn't hold up under current disability laws." "The agreement was signed before those laws were enacted," Vincent's lawyer countered smoothly. "It's grandfathered in as part of the original trust." Luke's hands clenched into fists as he watched Vincent's smug expression. The man had planned this all along. He'd been keeping this document as his ace in the hole. Luke felt his blood beginning to boil, remembering all the pain and suffering Grace had endured because of this man's greed. Grace sat perfectly still at the witness stand, her face composed despite the bombshell that had just been dropped. Her fingers traced small circles on the wooden railing, a habit Luke had noticed she did when deep in thought. "Furthermore," Vincent's lawyer continued, The agreement specifically names Vincent Turner as the designated trustee in the event that no heir meets the requirements. This was Mr. Turner Sr.'s explicit wish. Luke couldn't contain himself any longer. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is bull." "Mr. Malone." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Control yourself or you'll be removed from this courtroom." Grace turned her head slightly toward the sound of Luke's voice, and he could see her slight shake of the head, a silent request for him to stay calm. He forced himself to sit back down, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Vincent stood up, straightening his expensive suit. "Your Honor, I never wanted it to come to this. I've only ever tried to honor my brother's wishes and protect our family's legacy. Grace's condition, unfortunate as it is, makes her unsuitable to manage such a vast fortune. I'm simply following the legal framework my brother put in place." Sarah Bennett was frantically flipping through her files, likely searching for anything that could counter this new development. The judge was studying the document carefully, her expression unreadable. Through it all, Grace remained eerily calm. She sat up straighter in her chair, her unseeing eyes directed toward her uncle's voice. There was something in her posture that Luke hadn't seen before. Not defeat, but rather a quiet determination. Luke's fury continued to simmer as he watched Vincent practically gloating. The man thought he'd won, thought he'd finally crushed any hope Grace had of reclaiming her birthright. Luke wanted nothing more than to wipe that smug look off Vincent's face with his fist. But Grace's composure kept him grounded. She didn't look beaten or broken. Instead, she looked like someone who knew something others didn't, someone who wasn't done fighting yet. Her hands had stopped their nervous movement and now rested calmly in her lap as the lawyers argued over the validity of the document. The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers as both legal teams huddled with their clients, discussing this unexpected turn of events. Yet through the chaos, Grace remained the eye of the storm, her calm presence a stark contrast to the tension surrounding her. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, before we proceed with my uncle's new evidence, I'd like to submit something of my own." The judge leaned forward. "Proceed, Ms. Turner." Luke watched as Grace's lawyer, Sarah Bennett, approached the bench with the recorder. His heart pounded against his chest. They'd been waiting for the right moment to use this evidence, and Grace had chosen her timing perfectly. "This is a recording from 3 months ago," Grace explained, her fingers interlocked in her lap. "It's a conversation between my uncle and me that took place in his study." Vincent shifted in his seat, his previous confidence wavering for just a moment. "Your Honor, I object. Any recording made without my knowledge would be inadmissible." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, holding up a document, "this recording was made in New York State, which has one-party consent laws for audio recordings. As long as one party consents to the recording, it's perfectly legal." The judge nodded. "Objection overruled. Let's hear the recording." Sarah pressed play, and Vincent's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. "You're being ridiculous, Grace. You know as well as I do that your condition makes you vulnerable. People will take advantage of you. That's why I've had to take these precautions." Grace's voice followed. "By stealing my inheritance? By hiding documents from me?" "I've done what was necessary," Vincent's recorded voice replied, cold and calculating. "Your father may have written the will in your favor, but we both know you're not capable of handling this responsibility. It's better for everyone if you just sign over your rights to me. I can make your life very comfortable, or very difficult. Your choice." Luke watched Vincent's face drain of color as the recording continued. The man's manicured nails dug into the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Are you threatening me, Uncle Vincent?" Grace's recorded voice asked. "Threatening? No, my dear. Just stating facts. Who do you think arranged for your current situation? Your blindness wasn't entirely accidental, you know. Sometimes we have to take drastic measures to protect the family fortune." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Vincent's lawyer jumped to his feet, but the damage was done. The recording continued to play, revealing more of Vincent's manipulations and threats. Luke glanced at Grace, who sat perfectly still, her face turned toward her uncle. Even without her sight, she seemed to stare right through him, years of pain and determination evident in her posture. The judge raised her hand, stopping the recording. "Mr. Turner, would you care to explain these statements?" Vincent tugged at his collar, his usual polish cracking. "Your Honor, this recording is clearly edited. It's taken out of context." "We have the original file," Sarah interjected, "complete with metadata and timestamp. We're happy to have it analyzed by court-appointed experts." The judge's expression hardened as she looked at Vincent. "I believe that would be appropriate. In light of this new evidence, I'm also ordering all documents presented today, including the recently submitted trust agreement, to be thoroughly authenticated." Luke watched as Vincent's smugness completely evaporated, replaced by barely concealed panic. The man who had seemed so confident just minutes ago now looked like he was searching for an escape route. Grace sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. She had played her card perfectly, waiting until Vincent thought he had won before revealing her evidence. The judge called for a brief recess to review the new evidence, and Vincent huddled with his lawyers, his voice urgent and strained. His perfect plan was unraveling, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Patricia Morgan returned to her seat. Her face was stern, her glasses perched low on her nose as she reviewed the final documents before her. Grace stood at the defendant's table, her hand resting lightly on Luke's arm for support. Despite her blindness, she held her head high, facing forward with quiet dignity. Across the aisle, Vincent sat with his lawyers, his previously immaculate appearance now disheveled. His tie hung loose around his neck, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. The recording had shattered his carefully constructed facade, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. "After reviewing all evidence presented," Judge Morgan began, her voice filling the hushed courtroom, "including the recently submitted audio recording and the subsequent authentication reports, this court is prepared to render its decision." Luke felt Grace's fingers tighten slightly on his arm. He covered her hand with his own, offering silent support. "The evidence clearly shows that Vincent Turner has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud and manipulation," the judge continued. "The documentation proves he deliberately withheld crucial information about the family trust, falsified medical records, and most disturbingly, may have been involved in the incident that resulted in Ms. Turner's loss of sight." Vincent's lawyer started to rise, but Vincent pulled him back down, his face ashen. "Furthermore," Judge Morgan's voice grew sharper, "the audio recording confirms Mr. Turner's direct admission to these actions, as well as his attempt to coerce Ms. Grace Turner into surrendering her rightful inheritance through threats and intimidation." The judge shuffled her papers, then looked directly at Vincent. "Mr. Turner, your actions represent a profound breach of both legal and familial trust. You took advantage of a vulnerable family member for personal gain, manipulated legal documents, and potentially orchestrated physical harm to maintain control of assets that were never rightfully yours." Grace stood perfectly still, her composure unwavering. Luke watched her face, seeing the years of pain and uncertainty finally beginning to lift. "Therefore," Judge Morgan continued, "this court finds in favor of Grace Turner. The family trust and all associated assets are to be immediately transferred to her control, as per the original terms of her parents' will." She paused, turning a page in her documentation. "Additionally, Mr. Vincent Turner is hereby ordered to provide full restitution for all misappropriated funds, with interest." A small gasp rippled through the courtroom. Vincent slumped in his chair, his empire crumbling around him. Furthermore, the judge added, her tone severe, given the criminal nature of Mr. Turner's actions, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution. Mr. Turner, you will surrender your passport to the court and remain within the jurisdiction pending those proceedings. Grace's lawyer leaned over, whispering something in her ear. A small smile touched Grace's lips. Not one of triumph, but of relief. Court officers, Judge Morgan commanded. Please take Mr. Turner into custody until bond can be arranged. 2 officers approached Vincent, who stood shakily, his face a mask of disbelief. As they led him past Grace's table, he stopped for a moment, opening his mouth as if to speak. But no words came. For the first time in his life, Vincent Turner had nothing left to say. This court is adjourned, Judge Morgan declared, bringing down her gavel with a decisive crack. The sound echoed through the courtroom, marking the end of Grace's long struggle for justice and Vincent's reign of manipulation and deceit. The courtroom buzzed with activity as Judge Morgan's words hung in the air. Grace's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the wooden table before her. Tears streamed down her face, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of justice finally served. Luke stood beside her, his large frame providing a steady anchor in the storm of emotions. He watched as Grace processed the magnitude of what had just happened. Her shoulders shook slightly, and he instinctively moved closer, letting her know he was there. "It's over," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible above the commotion. "After all this time, it's really over." Their lawyer, Sarah Matthews, began gathering the papers spread across their table, sliding them into her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Congratulations, Grace," she said warmly. "You did it. You stood up for yourself, and you won." Grace nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The dark scarf covering her eyes had shifted slightly during the proceedings, and she adjusted it with careful fingers. "I couldn't have done it alone," she said, her voice stronger now. "None of this would have been possible without everyone's help." The courtroom gradually emptied, but Grace remained rooted to her spot, as if afraid moving might break the spell of their victory. Luke understood her hesitation. He'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes the biggest moments needed time to sink in. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" he asked gently, pulling out a chair for her. Grace nodded, lowering herself into the seat. Her hands folded in her lap, fingers intertwining nervously. "Luke," she began, then stopped, overcome with emotion. He sat down beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. The empty courtroom felt peaceful now, like a church after service. Through the tall windows, afternoon sunlight streamed in, creating patterns on the polished floor. "I keep thinking about that day at the bus stop," Grace said softly. "I was so lost, so afraid. And then you stopped." She reached out, finding his hand with surprising accuracy. "You could have driven past. Most people would have. But you didn't." Luke looked down at their joined hands, remembering that cold afternoon. "Couldn't leave you there," he said simply. "Wouldn't have been right." Grace's lips curved into a smile, transforming her whole face. "That's just it, isn't it? You always do what's right, even when it's hard, even when it means taking on a blind girl's problems and facing down her corrupt uncle." "You did all the hard work," Luke protested. "You're the brave one." Grace shook her head, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. "I found my courage because you believed in me. When everyone else in my life had abandoned me or betrayed me, you stood by my side. You gave me strength when I had none left." The weight that had pressed down on Grace for so long seemed to lift from her shoulders. She sat straighter, her chin held high. The scared girl from the bus stop was gone, replaced by a woman who had fought for her future, and won. She turned toward Luke, and though she couldn't see him, her face held such gratitude that it made his heart ache. "Thank you," she said simply, those two words carrying the weight of everything they'd been through together. Luke squeezed her hand gently, understanding all the things she wasn't saying. Sometimes the biggest changes in life came from the smallest acts of kindness, like stopping for a stranger at a bus stop on a cold afternoon. 2 weeks after the trial, Grace stood in an empty storefront on Main Street, her fingers trailing along the dusty counter. Though she couldn't see the space, she could feel its potential in every step she took, in every echo that bounced off the walls. "It's bigger than I remembered," she said, turning toward the sound of Luke's heavy boots on the wooden floor. "And the windows, they face east, right?" "Yeah," Luke replied, his voice warm with approval. "Morning sun'll stream right in here. Place'll be filled with light." Grace nodded, picturing it in her mind. Perfect for a welcome center. People need light when they're starting over. She moved carefully around the counter, her hands mapping out the space. "We can put comfortable chairs here, maybe some small tables. Make it feel like home." Luke watched her navigate the room with growing confidence. Gone was the frightened girl from the bus stop. In her place stood a woman with purpose, her movements sure and deliberate. She'd traded her dark scarf for stylish sunglasses, and her blonde hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said, moving closer to stand beside her. Grace's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I want to create a place where people can come when they have nowhere else to turn. Not just a shelter or a soup kitchen, though we'll have those too, but somewhere that helps people rebuild their lives." She reached out, finding Luke's arm with practiced ease. "Like you helped me rebuild mine." "Sounds like a big project," Luke said, but his voice held no doubt, only support. "It is," Grace agreed. "That's why I need your help." She turned to face him, her expression earnest. "You know what it's like to start over, to fight your way back? And you're good with your hands. We'll need someone who can fix things, make this place work." Luke looked around the empty storefront, seeing past its current state to what it could become. The walls needed paint, the floors needed refinishing, and the whole place needed a good cleaning. But he could see it. A warm, welcoming space where people could find hope. "You sure you want me involved?" he asked, his voice gruff with emotion. "My reputation in town?" Grace cut him off with a gentle squeeze of his arm. "Is exactly what we need. You're living proof that people can change, that the past doesn't define us." She smiled, the expression lighting up her whole face. "Besides, who else would I trust to help me build this dream?" Luke felt something warm spread through his chest. He'd spent so many years trying to outrun his past, trying to prove he was more than his mistakes. And here was Grace, offering him not just acceptance, but partnership. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Where do we start?" Grace's smile widened. "First, we need to clean this place up. Then we'll need furniture, supplies." She paused, laughing softly. "I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I?" "Nah," Luke chuckled, the sound echoing in the empty space. "Just means you're excited. It's good." They stood together in the dusty storefront, surrounded by possibility. Through the windows, they could hear the familiar sounds of their small town. Cars passing, people chatting on the sidewalk, the distant whistle of the afternoon train. "We should probably come up with a name," Grace mused, running her hand along the counter again. "Something hopeful." "We've got time," Luke said softly. "We'll figure it out together." The setting sun painted the storefront in warm oranges and pinks, its rays catching the freshly painted sign that read, New Horizons Community Center. Grace stood on the sidewalk, taking in the familiar sounds and scents of their achievement. Fresh paint, newly cut wood, and the lingering aroma of coffee from their small cafe area. Luke stepped out beside her, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Just finished setting up the last bookshelf in the reading room," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of pride. "Everything's ready for tomorrow's grand opening." Grace turned toward his voice, smiling. "I can't believe we did it. 3 months ago, this was just an empty building full of dust and dreams." She reached out, finding the wooden post of the entrance. Her fingers traced the smooth surface, remembering how Luke had spent hours sanding it to perfection. "Now it's real." "More than real," Luke agreed, watching as the last rays of sunlight caught in her hair. She looked different now, stronger, more confident. The scared girl from the bus stop had blossomed into someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. "We've already got a waiting list for the job training program." Grace nodded, her expression brightening. "And the support group starts next week. Did Mrs. Peterson confirm she'll lead it?" "Called this morning to say she's looking forward to it." Luke moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "She said having someone like you backing the center makes people feel safe coming forward with their stories." "Someone like me?" Grace raised an eyebrow above her sunglasses. "Someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and still find the strength to rebuild." Luke's voice softened. "Someone who shows others that their past doesn't define them." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I had help," she said quietly. "A rather intimidating-looking mechanic who turned out to have the kindest heart in town." Luke chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Don't let that get around. I've got a reputation to maintain." "Oh, I think that reputation is pretty much shot," Grace teased. "I saw you helping little Tommy with his reading yesterday, and Mrs. Johnson tells everyone how you fixed her wheelchair for free." "Yeah, well?" Luke shuffled his feet, embarrassed but pleased. "Speaking of Tommy, his mom stopped by earlier. Says he's excited about the after-school program." Grace's face lit up. "That's wonderful. He's such a bright kid. He just needs someone to believe in him." She paused, turning her face toward the last warmth of the setting sun. "Like someone believed in us." The street was quiet now, most shops closed for the day. A gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. It was peaceful, the kind of peace both of them had once thought impossible to find. "You know," Grace said softly, "when I first came to this town, I thought I had nothing left. No family, no future, no hope." She reached out, finding Luke's arm with practiced ease. "I never imagined I'd find everything I needed right here." Luke looked down at her hand on his arm, remembering all the moments that had led them here, the confrontations, the courtroom battles, the late nights planning and dreaming. They'd fought their way through darkness to build something meaningful, something that would help others find their way too. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Luke held out his hand, and Grace took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with familiar comfort. "Ready to head in?" he asked. "We've got a big day tomorrow." "Yes," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "I'm ready." "I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."